What was the moment for you when you realized the mainstream media are just, they're not doing a good job of journalism anymore? Because I can tell you what, for a lot of people who are sort of heterodox center, where I see us, and right-leaning people too, one of the key moments was Jordan Peterson being interviewed by Kathy Newman. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, of course.
And a lot of people just went, wait, this is fake. This isn't a conversation. This isn't how people talk. If you had a psychology professor in your living room that you may disagree with, that's not how you would talk to them. And if you did talk to them like that, you'd think this person's demented, right? Yeah. Was there a moment like that for you, coming from a left-wing perspective, where you were just like, I saw that and I was like, okay, there's no going back for the mainstream anymore?
There's so many. I mean, it happens every week, doesn't it? I think for me, one of the wow moments was, I think at the time, Andrew Marr was the BBC political editor, and he wrote a novel, which I find quite strange. You shouldn't really have time to write a novel when you're earning hundreds of thousands of pounds paid by the BBC. But anyway, maybe I'm being mean. And the launch party for that novel, can you guess where it was? Number 10 Downing Street. And so you think your job is to scrutinise these people. They're doing you a favour to launch your novel. And I just thought, you're not serious. Like, you shouldn't be hectoring them and being angry with them, but there should be a slight frisson, a slight tension between politicians and political journalists. They should just be a bit wary of that guy, be careful, don't be too loose-lipped. That's healthy for democracy. And when I saw that story, I thought, I think the BBC's buggered, and I think more broadly the relationship between politicians and the media in this country is buggered. It is so unhealthy, and I think it's worse in the US because in this country everything's in London. Everything's in London, whereas in the US you've got your politicians in Washington, you've got your LA people, your Texas people, your New York people. Here it's so bad.
It isn't. It's a very profound point, but here it is bad. Was there a moment for you where you realised that left-wing media wasn't everything it purported to be? Where you looked at certain outlets, I mean, maybe it's The Guardian, maybe it's others, where you thought, hang on a minute, this isn't what I associate with the left or left-wing media?
Well, there's not that much left-wing media in the UK. So, I mean, I'd start with, take the Daily Mirror. It's been a Labour supporting paper for a very long time. You know, I remember doing BBC Any Questions, and I mentioned a story, and then, you know, this is Middle England, right? I was somewhere in like Yeovil or something, you know, Lib Dem Tory floating voters. This is Middle England. And I said, oh, the story's from the Daily Mirror. They all started laughing at me, right? Rightly so, because for them it's a tabloid. You know, I don't think it has necessarily a sort of political take on things. You know, it's a spin on, you know, it's like The Sun, but the other side. I don't think it's quite as bad, but, you know, that's the ballpark. The Guardian, I think, is a liberal paper rather than a left paper, but, you know, we can park that for a moment. What I would say is that The Guardian has really regressed. So 10 years ago, it had the bravery to do the Snowden stuff. It had the bravery to do the WikiLeaks stuff. That would not happen now. That would not happen.
Why not?
I think editorial choices would just say, I just don't think it would happen. I think, well, definitely with WikiLeaks. Snowden, I don't know. With WikiLeaks and the Glenn Greenwald stuff, I think, you know, it's easy to say, oh, Alan Rusbridge is gone, Kath Vine is the editor now, they wouldn't do that. But I just feel like there's not the same intellectual curiosity there used to be at The Guardian, even 15 years ago.
That's fair.
And I can't quite, you know, I would buy The Guardian 15 years ago. I wouldn't buy it now. I wouldn't pay for it now. You know, I have a subscription for the FT. I read the FT and it's full of facts and data, and I'll disagree with all the columnists, but it's useful, high-value information. I'm sorry to say The Guardian isn't that, you know.
And do you think part of the problem is identity politics and writing through always the prism of race and gender? And that's not to say that that doesn't have merit occasionally, but that then means that you just ignore the sheer facts of the situation, what is happening on the ground.
Well, the problem is I don't really read The Guardian, so I don't know. But, you know, I agree with your point here. So, for instance, there's something that really irritates me, which is your X, this person's Y, therefore this person is the only person that can have valid opinions on issues relating to Y people. That can be with regards to race, gender, etc. So, for instance, I'm half Iranian. I might say I think the protests in Iran are bad. I don't think they're bad. Before, if you clip that up, I might say they're bad. I might say something which is quite controversial, right? At which point, you might say, as somebody who's not Iranian, well, I disagree. They seem quite good. It's about women's liberation, civil liberties. They seem very positive. I would say, you can't have a legitimate view on this because you're not Iranian. Well, somewhere in the middle of all this are the facts and the truth and values, which they aren't contingent on who you are, your identity, and so on. So on that point, I agree with you. Is it a problem really for the Guardian? It's a hard one to say. I mean, I just don't read their columns that much. I think actually it's worse than that in a way, because this stuff has percolated a whole layer of the media, and you can find it in ad campaigns, you can find it in The Guardian, you might even find it in sort of centre-right newspapers sometimes.
Yeah.
For sure.
So I think it's a bit bigger than that, actually, yeah.
Well, our whole society is infested with this idea, actually, that we should look at everything through the prism of, well, you can't speak about this because you're not that thing. I agree. I was curious, you mentioned there's not much left-wing media in the UK. Are you one of the people on the left who feels that the BBC is right-leaning?
No, I think the BBC is liberal, right? So what do I mean by that? It's socially liberal, and it has a socially liberal agenda. Absolutely. It was absolutely opposed to Brexit. I say that somebody who voted Remain. It was opposed to Brexit. And it's also economically liberal. So I think it's very, what's the word? Circumspect about radical economic ideas, particularly from the left. But actually, I think any kind of radical economic ideas. Anybody who's saying, there's a problem, let's try this solution. An actual solution-oriented sort of mode of thinking just doesn't sit well with them. So I think lots of people from the left dislike the BBC because they see the fact it's economically liberal. Then lots of people from the right see the BBC and they say, well, it's socially liberal. And so I can see both points of view. But it is, and because we don't have a successful liberal party in this country anymore, which we did until the early 20th century, it is very much a continuation of that sort of patrician liberalism, which was the Liberal Party, which broadly speaking, after it collapsed, kind of becomes a faction within both Labour and the Tories. So the BBC has kind of progressive moments, and I'm sure it has like journalists who are on the left for sure. Yeah. But I would say it's a liberal news organisation.
So explain that to us, because those words, liberal and left, get used very differently by different people, and they also get used very differently in the United States versus the UK. Like, what do you mean? What's the difference? How are these things different?
So a really great way of explaining this, I think, is the fact that the BBC, I think it's changed now, but they didn't have an industrial relations correspondent. They didn't have a Labour correspondent. So or editor rather. I think they had a correspondent. They didn't have a Labour editor, which they would have had all the way through really to the 1980s, which is somebody whose job is to say, these workers are getting screwed here, 1,000 people have just been laid off here, like the P&O story, for instance, right? These people have gone on strike, they've got a big pay rise. These women are campaigning for better maternity leave conditions at work, etc. The BBC doesn't focus on that stuff. Now, as somebody who's on the left, I care about that stuff, right? I care deeply about that stuff. Instead, the BBC will focus on, like, as a liberal organisation, representation. More women in boardrooms, right? I'm not saying more women in boardrooms is bad.
Although it is.
I'm not saying it's bad, but that affects a tiny slither of society. Yeah. Meanwhile, you're not talking about women organising in their workplaces for better maternity care policies, for instance.
Yeah. Well, so that makes perfect sense. And I remember during the whole Ngozi Fulani affair, it was covered like it was a terrorist attack. When you sort of think there's probably much bigger core issues affecting way more people